All right. So we're picking back up with lecture 7. So we've had a part A. This will be part B. I'm pretty sure there's going to be a part C. This is kind of a long one. I'm going to deal more predominantly with Judaism than Christianity, but they kind of come together. You could call it the kind of clash if you want to look at it that way, or anyway, there's some overlap here. I mentioned chronological order twice in our last lecture, so I'll pick up where I left off last week. It has been said by some scholars that the genealogies in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament letters contain mistakes. At times, a son begets his father, followed by the father begetting his grandfather, the son's grandfather. Genealogies such as these are assembled least to greatest or greatest to least. David could be listed before his father Yishai, and Shlomo, that's Solomon if you don't know, could be listed before his father David. If the writer sees Shlomo as having achieved a greater name for himself than David, further, if David was seen as having achieved a greater name for himself than his father, it could be said that David begat Yishai. I'm going to go off script a little bit here and talk about that's idiomatic what I just said. Achieved a greater name does not mean that one was more famous than the other. Or sold more records than the other or something like that. It means that one was seen as a greater warrior. Like David was, of course, a warrior, so he'd be seen as greater than his father Yishai, where Shlomo was seen as the wisest man that ever lived. He would be seen as greater than David, right? So you may see a genealogy where those names are essentially backwards. Well, you're not going to see that in the Hebrew Bible because the editors would have changed that around because people didn't know that's why they did that. There were definitely more generations than 14 between Adam and David, and more than 14 generations between David and Yeshua. The New Testament letters, the genealogies convey people in Yeshua's lineage who were standouts for one reason or the other. Thus, there were 14 Yehudim or Jews rather, who stood out to the writer, like say of Levi. They call it Matthew. His name was actually Levi, and it begins with this genealogy, if you will. So for him, there were 14 Jews who stood out between Adam and David, and then 14 Jews who stood out between David and Yeshua. That's all that means. It doesn't mean there were literally just 14 and 14, because that's not true. Though it may seem strange to do something like this to modern Western thinkers, this was in fact normal practice by the Yehudim, by the Jews who wrote the Hebrew Bible and the Jews who wrote the New Testament letters. It is also very important to point out that chronological order was not utilized by the writers of these texts, as chronological order did not exist in, let's call it, biblical Yehudim culture, biblical Jewish culture of that time period. And by that, I mean of the time period of the writing of what the Christians call the Old Testament, and the time period going on into the time period of the writing of what Christians call the New Testament. That whole period of time, this did not exist. Chronological order did not exist in the writing style. It did exist, at least in the New Testament period, among some Jews, but I mean, they were surrounded by it with Hellenism, but they didn't write that way. Anyway, this is immensely important in the New Testament letters because translators, Christians in particular, have come to very incorrect conclusions by their ignorance of this fact. Most Christian organizations believe that the second coming of Christ, as they call it, is yet to come. So much so that they even invented the word rapture. to explain the second coming with its destruction of the temple, the war and destruction that goes with it. They see the letter of Revelation as futuristic, mostly due to the fact that the events tied to the sons of the two different kings are out of chronological order. Christians completely ignore the words of Yeshua, who said, this generation will not pass away until all is fulfilled. Meaning the second coming was going to happen before the people standing there, before all the people standing there listening to his words that day died. So we either have some very old people living and walking among us, or Yeshua knew what he was talking about, and the second coming happened before they died. You can look that up in Matthew 24:34, Mark 13:30, and Luke 21:32. The Yehudim, the Jews, uh, who wrote the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament letters, tied events and subject matter together by association, not chronology. Since I have not yet published my translation of the New Testament letters, I will give you an example of this from the Hebrew Bible and make you wait for the association of the sons of the king in Revelation until the book comes out. Does that make any sense? So let's take a look at Vayikra, also known as Leviticus, chapters 10 and chapter 16. Chapter 10 begins with the story of two of the sons of Aharon, Nadav and Abihu, being burned to death after making a sacrifice of what the English Bible calls strange fire. Chapter 16, verse 1, which takes place a fair amount of time later, brings that story back up. As you can imagine, many rabbim and sages over the past 3,000 years or so had spent much time and effort attempting to explain what these men did to cause them to lose their lives, and why this story is being told not only again, but why is this story out of chronological order? The answer is actually quite simple. Chapter 10 gives us the story, while chapter 16 gives us the details on how the sacrifice is to be carried out. The story is brought up because Aharon, or Aaron, is about to make the same sacrifice that his sons were attempting to make when they died. Thus, the association between the two occurrences of the story, and not a mistake in chronological order. They are not meant to show us some secret additional meaning to the story. The association between the two occurrences of the same story is that they are the same sacrifice. Bringing up the death of Nadav and Abihu was not a warning to Aharon because God was worried, or better yet, knew that Aharon was about to mess things up. That was suggested by several sages, mostly from the Dark Ages. Bringing up the two dead sons of Aharon. Oh, I just said that. The association is made simply because it was part of the normal writing style of the time. It was part of the normal writing style of the time. There is one other possible reason why the association was made. Moshe prophesied to his people that there would come a time when they would turn their backs on God, resulting in their captivity. During the time of Ezra, portions of the Torah were lost. The temple had been destroyed, and the Kohanim, the priest, had gone into captivity with their people. This means that knowledge and understanding of the Torah was going to be interrupted, or was interrupted, I should say it that way. By placing this association in chapter 16, it assured that no one would eventually think that the sacrifice in chapter 16 was somehow different than the sacrifice in chapter 10. That's speculative on my part because it's not really the reason why you do that, but it may well have been why God made sure that got slipped in. Just saying. Okay, to pick back up from last week. The letters written by the apostles were all written by Jewish rabbis, who wrote in differing rabbinic teaching styles. For those who argue that Luke was a Gentile, I will address this a little later. The New Testament I think I already have actually. The New Testament letters were written utilizing Jewish allegory, homily, simile, parable, hyperbole, and idiomatic phrases. To say the least, much of the original meaning is lost when translating from that language and time to ours. There are now more than 2,000 years of separation from the culture and customs of the biblical period. While the New Testament letters contain many idioms, the first century dialect of Yisraeli Hebrew is idiomatic, which means that nothing they said or wrote is literal. However, the dialect being idiomatic does not mean that there is nothing literal in the text. How to know when to take something literally and or idiomatically is beyond the scope of this lecture. I will say this: it is safer to assume idiomatic than literal. Here's an example of how idiomatic languages work from our modern Western world. And I may have already talked about that, but humor me, please. A wife and her husband are in their home. The wife looks at the husband, points to the floor, and says, "Are those your socks?" Well, we all know that the wife wants her husband to pick the socks up, and that she is in no way confused as to the ownership of those socks. The thinking process of the rabbis who wrote the New Testament letters, was much like this example, pretty much exactly like this example. Yet there are those who stake their doctrine on a literal understanding of passages written in this manner. It is like believing that cats and dogs actually fall out of the sky when someone says it's raining cats and dogs. It's exactly the same approach to understanding the New Testament. Let's talk about the thinking process. Our way of thinking in the West is vastly different from that of the Bible. Jewish writers of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament letters, for example, in the West, we think of our past as things that happened a long time ago. We think of our present as things that are happening right now. Finally, we think of our future as things that will happen in the coming minutes, hours, days, months, years. However, what we think of as the past, biblical Jews saw as the future. Here's how that works. Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all lived before us, not after us. They are all where we are going. Thus, they are in the future, not the past. To the biblical Jews, there is no present time, as we are always behind our forefathers. Thus, there is only future and past. The past is right now and what is to come, while the future is that which we are headed toward, which is, again, those people and events who have gone before us. In short, we live in the past because we are at the end of the line. The longer time goes on, the further into the past people are. Yes, Hebrew primers and grammar books will say otherwise. They do, in fact, identify words as past, present, and future tense, like our Western languages. But this is a matter of Western languages, Western peoples, Western thinkers attempting to understand biblical Eastern languages through the lens of Western language. This approach is wrong and obscures our understanding of the Bible. Modern Hebrew is saturated with idioms, almost too many to count, maybe even too many to count, actually. Additionally, modern Hebrew is more literal in nature, like all other Western languages. Early biblical Hebrew had a massive number of idioms. The language was, at least to some degree, perhaps all the way, idiomatic in nature. However, by the Second Temple period, Hebrew was a completely idiomatic language in Israel. Further confusing modern readers is the fact that first century idioms tended to have many different meanings and were often played with, which of course further changed their intended meanings. For example, we have a saying, let's make like a tree and leaf. One could play with the words of that saying and say, let's make like a tree and bark, because trees have bark, just like they have leaves. I said that to be funny. In this case, playing with the words renders this saying meaningless, but it will make people laugh, and that may be the actual point. Idioms were often nested inside other idioms. There is a teaching style from the Bible called remez, which was heavily used by the writers of the New Testament, by the way. We will get into that later. Suffice it to say here that remez was a hinting back to a biblical verse that was known to the reader and or listeners. In fact, it wasn't even just to the Bible. Shaul hinted back to a poet who lived in his time. A lot of people don't know that Shaul quoted a poet. Okay, the Jews of this period also nested remez to a specific scripture inside a remez to a different scripture. Add nesting remez to nesting idioms inside idioms within a nested remez, and the reader today begins to believe that the text is misquoted, tampered with, or wrong. Acts chapter 2, verse 2 is a remez to Isaiah 59:19. Verse 3 is a remez to Exodus 20:18. Verses 9 through 11 are a remez to Isaiah 11:11. Verses 16 through 21 are a remez to Yoel, that's Joel, 2:28 through 32. And if all that wasn't enough, there is a remez to Yeshayahu, or Isaiah 11, 1 through 12, nested inside the remez of Yoel 2:28 through 32. Not understanding the use of remez opened the door for Christians and Jews to willy-nilly chain verses together. Jews are way worse at it, or way worse about doing it than the Christians are. Way worse. Just read the Talmud. You'll know what I'm talking about. Remez is a partial quote of a verse or even a partial paraphrasing of a verse. It doesn't have to be a partial quote. When nesting a remez, the subject of the verses must all be the same. This is a hard and fast rule. Christians and Jews today tend to tie partial verses together that are unrelated in subject and thus create a new subject. Or better put, this method creates a new and false doctrine. For example, he slew his servants. Go and do likewise. Go ahead and go to the computer. This is my new verse. He slew his servants. Go and do likewise. Do thou likewise. Obviously, now that you can see that the first part is a remez to Second Chronicles. 2 Chronicles. It sounds like Donald Trump. Second 25:3, and then the next part of that is a remez to Luke 10:37. What has this done? I took two verses that have nothing to do with each other, are not on the same subject. I put them together, and now I have a new subject or a new false doctrine. Okay, come back to me. I think I just said that. Okay, well, so maybe you're saying, Rob, no one does that. Okay, so how about something that has been said to me many times? It has been said to me, Rob, short for Robert. Let's move to the screen, please. Much learning doth make thee mad. We need no man to teach us when the Spirit will guide us into all truth. I'm sorry, I didn't quite do that the way I thought I did. All right, so you can see, much learning doth make thee mad. You have no idea how many times someone said that to me. That's from Acts 26:24. And then they, of course, take out the ye and say, we need, instead of not, no, they leave out that any, man teach us. They change you to us. Then from 1 John 2:27, I think they pretty much leave out the when he, and then they just jump straight to the Spirit. They leave out truth is come he will guide, instead of us, you into all truth. You have no idea how many times this has been said to me over the years. Okay. In Acts 26:24, Shaul did indeed have much education, but was in no way, shape, or form mad or crazy. In fact, the next verse says Shaul was not crazy. The next verse. I point that out because my overabundance of education has not made me crazy either. It was not true about Shaul, the guy they call Paul, and it's not true about me. In 1 John 2:27, not only is this verse always misquoted, but Yochanan, or John, was speaking specifically to men he had taught to live according to the Torah. He was not speaking to people who lived some 2,000 years after his death. In short, these words do not apply to any of those of you who use these words in this manner. Not one of you. You weren't there. He did not train you. In John 16:13, this verse is also always misquoted. The same people who use this part of the verse about their personal lack of education and training never say anything about being kicked out of the synagogues or being killed by people who think they are doing God a favor from verse 2. Yeah, they kind of leave that out. They never seem to realize that Yeshua was speaking directly to the men who followed him for 3 years, not Christians. All right. Let's talk about connecting the wrong verse to Remez. Further complicating a good translation is the fact that the translators often connect the wrong verse to the obvious Remez. Many of the words from the Remez will match a number of the words found in other scriptures. More often than not, the word matching is done with English words instead of Hebrew or Greek. Translators tend to pick the, I shouldn't even say this about translators, of course, did this, but this is more common among Christians and Jews. Just read the Talmud. But no, we're just going to call them translators. Translators tend to pick the scripture that matches their preconceived beliefs, as they generally did not know that the subject had to match. In short, if the subject of the Remez does not match the subject of the verse it is being tied to, it is wrong. Paraphrasing verses from the Hebrew Bible and then literally translating them into Greek makes the Hebrew text hard to recognize, sometimes impossible. Further nesting idioms, rewording and or paraphrasing them, and then nesting them in verses nested to other or inside other verses plays a huge role in why translators concluded that much of the Greek text makes no sense. How could it? I hope you heard what I just said. Taking this idea even further, the text of the New Testament letters in their entirety were taken from an idiomatic dialect of the Hebrew language, much like the dialect found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, if not, well, it's not identical, but it's so close it's unbelievable. Not recognizing the idiomatic nature of Second Temple Hebrew, as well as verse and idiom nesting, especially once it is hidden by Greek words, and in particular Greek punctuation, has driven the idea of a vulgar or poorly spoken Greek dialect. Thus, the idea of Koine Greek, Koine being the Greek word for perverted, was invented to explain away the translator's inability to comprehend the words of the Shelichim, the words of the apostles. Words and phrases were used interchangeably. Davar, mitzvot, and Torah are great examples of interchangeable words. There is a great example of phrases being used interchangeably in the story of the crazy man or men among the tombs. Matthew 8:28 used the Greek word daimonizomenoi. It's a big word, sorry. To describe the two men who lived among the tombs and could not be shackled. Mark 5:2 used the word pneumati, or words, it's two words, pneumati akatarto. I had to say that slow because I can never say that word right, which literally means unclean spirit, to describe the man, the man who lived among the tombs and could not be shackled, of course. Luke 8:27 used the word daimonia to describe a certain man who lived among the tombs and, of course, couldn't be shackled. Matthew utilized daimonizomenoi, which is actually two words, but it's been slammed together, to indicate that these men were overcome with a condition. That's why he used it. Luke utilized pneumati, here we go with that word I have so much trouble with, akatarto, to show that this was a condition of the heart. Luke simply utilized the Greek name most commonly connected to the condition, which was daimonia. You hear demon there? You'd probably see it if you could see the spelling. Additionally, there are times when those idiomatic stories are layered. For example, Matthew's story mentions two men living among the tombs. This was a veiled message. The two men represented Israel, that's the first one, and Yehuda or Judah, that's the second one. That's the two men. In recognition of the northern and southern tribes, when they split up and 10 went to the north and the other two stayed to the south, that's why they call it, that's why you see Israel and Judah. That's what that references to. John and Luke only spoke of one person, Israel, as the children of God. Either way, all Jews are being recognized. You can call them one nation, or you can call them by the two names. Using the two names speaks of a divided people, while using one name speaks of the Jews as one people. Divided or not, doesn't matter. It was obvious to the readers of these letters at the time of their writing that this story was a parable concerning the state of non-Torah observance among God's people, a parable. There is absolutely no chance that a man could tear apart the chains and trample on them. No man, no matter how strong, how high, or how crazy, could do this. It is idiomatic and should have made it clear that this story was never meant to be taken literally. It's taken literally because of the way it was translated. It didn't happen, is what I'm trying to tell you, not in a literal sense. The swine in these stories represented the Jewish leadership, and saying that they were grazing meant that they were living the good life, or as we might say today in English, coming from this very it's a rewording of this very same idiom. We might say today they were living high on the hog. That's where this comes from, is this verse. It's just a rewording of the same thing. Further, to say that these leaders, in other words, the swine, went over the cliff and drowned into the sea was meant to convey that they and their followers had forsaken the truth and lived like all other godless nations. That's what that idiom means. There is a difference between translation and transliteration. To translate a word is to give its meaning. For example, the Hebrew word Elohim means God. It is used of the one and only God who created the heavens and the earth and all that is in them. However, the word is also used generically of men of high stature, rulers such as governors, nobles, kings. It's also used of great warriors and even of false gods. It's just a generic word. It certainly isn't the name of God. On the other hand, transliteration is the process in which the alphabet of one language is substituted for another. The purpose is to help a person properly pronounce a word or words from a language he or she does not speak. All right. So, for example, go to the computer, please. These Hebrew words. Now, those of you who do not have the ability to read those Hebrew words, you're going to need a little help. You want to impress your little crowd. You want to make your people think you're a really smart person. So what do? Well, you do this. So I've color-coded the words. You wouldn't normally do that, but I've color-coded the words so I can show you transliteration. This first word is vayomer. So you have the vav, and it's in that kind of bluish color. So you put a, and if you should use these dashes in between the syllables to help you say va, yo, mer. So you see that these two symbols right here, even though you don't know what they mean, if somebody types yo, you now know that they make the yo sound. And then you have these two symbols here. If you don't read it, you don't realize that makes the mer sound. And on and on and on it goes. So now, because this is in your alphabet, you can say Vayomer Elohim Yehi Or Vayehi Or. You don't have to roll your R's. It's kind of a habit for me. Okay, come on back. There are many words in the New Testament that are transliterated Hebrew words. Some of those words were missed by the translators, and the result of missing those words was, at times, mistranslation. It was certainly misunderstanding and misapplication of the Greek text. For example, in Matthew 2:1, the Hebrew word magon was transliterated into Greek as magon, M-A-G-O-N in Greek letters. It is from the root magan, which means to give into one's power. For example, Genesis 14:20 says, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered, there's your word magon, your enemies into your hands. Of course, speaking of the enemies of the Jews, have been given into the power of the Jewish people. In other words, the Jewish people beat them in war. Thus, the so-called wise men were couriers or messengers sent from some place in the Orient, bringing them near to Jerusalem to deliver gifts into the hands of Yeshua's parents. The Greek word for wise men was sophos, which is where we get the English word sophisticate. Since the Greek translators did not recognize that this was a transliterated Hebrew word, they connected its meaning to pagan astrologers instead of Jewish couriers or messengers. It might help our understanding if we simply ask and answer the following questions. Why and how would pagan astrologers know about a coming Mashiach Yehudim, a coming Jewish Messiah? Why and how would they know that? Why would pagan astrologers feel compelled to bring a Jewish Messiah gifts and then worship him? Well, this is actually fairly easy to answer because the Magon asked this question. Where is he who is born Melech HaYehudim? Where is he who is born King of the Jews? In the very next verse, clearly, they were Jewish couriers who knew they were looking for a Jewish king. In other words, a Jewish Messiah. As unlikely as it may seem, given the value of the gifts, these Magon could have been illiterate, uneducated, but loyal men who could be trusted to follow the so-called star and deliver the gifts. Okay, I want to compare something that is seen as a translational mistake, but is actually just a false understanding. An argument against the New Testament letters is that it says Jesus was in the home of a leper. Since this was a violation of biblical law, but the text does not say that Shimon had leprosy. It said that he was called the leper. It is possible that he was the only man whose name was Shimon among this group who had been healed of the disease, or perhaps he ministered to lepers. In the end, it was nothing more than a way to identify this Shimon in a sea of other men with that name. It was just an identifier. It was not saying that he was in the house of somebody covered in leprosy, right? I'm going to bring these up again. Actual conflicts in the translation. In the story of how Yeshua met Andariah and Peter, or Andariah and Capa, that's Andrew and Peter, in Matthew 4:18, it says that Yeshua saw the two brothers fishing together while walking by the sea. In Yochanan, or John 1, verses 35 through 42, it tells us that Andrew, I keep trying to say these words in Hebrew, I'm trying to say them in English for the purpose of the listener. Andrew, in John 1, 35 through 42, it tells us that Andrew stayed with Yeshua, Jesus, an entire day before leaving to find his brother Capa. One of these stories is wrong, and any attempt to harmonize these differing versions is little more than someone forcing what he wants to believe into the text. This approach to explaining away an obvious mistake, and it is a mistake, is called apologetics and is neither needed nor has it ever been accurate. It is what a boss of mine used to call a lesson in fiction. So, when the Christian Bible was first translated into English, the word chiche was used in place of ecclesia, which ecclesia means congregation. Chiche was eventually changed to the word church. I can't make that connection. I don't know where you get church out of chiche. This simple act, putting the word church in place of ecclesia, planted a religion that did not exist during the first century CE firmly into it, and thus altered reality. Putting the word church in place of ecclesia created a false reality. The church did not exist during the time of the Talmudim, during the time of the disciples. It was 330 or 40 years later that Constantine won his war. And you don't have a church until after Constantine. Well, you have the Catholicism, but it's now called the church. The church wasn't there, but by putting that word into the translation, boom, now it's there. Now, instead of Jews and their proselytes who followed Yeshua as Mashiach being persecuted for their beliefs, Christians who did not exist became the persecuted. Some scholars eventually recognized that the followers of Yeshua were, in fact, Jews, and thus began to call these followers Jewish Christians. That didn't really catch on. It's there if you read the scholars, certain scholars, they say that way, but it's hard to find. However, Christianity did not exist until after Constantine, as I just said, which means that followers of Yeshua were simply Mashiach following Jews. In short, the Jews who followed Yeshua did not change their religion, as the coming of a Jewish Mashiach in the first century was actually prophesied by Yirmiyahu and Daniel. Thus, Jews following Mashiach was a normal and expected part of Judaism in that time. The following is a great example of why every word should be taken back to its Hebrew equivalent. In actuality, the New Testament letters say almost nothing about non-Jews, but because Hebrew words such as Sar HaMaot, which means captain of the hundreds, was changed to centurion, yet another altered reality occurred. In the story of the cross, in which a Sar HaMaot, now called a centurion, proclaimed, "Truly, this was the Son of God." Matthew 27:54. Changing Sar HaMaot to centurion was, in fact, a proper translation. However, it caused the reader to imagine a Roman officer, or perhaps a Roman guard could have been, I guess that's the same thing, right? They see that their imagination, and every movie you've ever seen, there's some Roman dude there with the fuzzy thing on his helmet, standing there saying, "Surely this was the Son of God." So because of centurion, Christians have come to believe that a Roman centurion actually recognized the Jewish Messiah, even though Roman culture neither had a Messiah nor even the idea of what a Messiah might be. It did not exist among the Romans. How would he have known? I should mention here that when the Rashi HaKohanim, the chief priests, and the Perushim, the Pharisees, asked Pilato for Roman guards, they were refused. Thus, no centurion recognized the Jewish Mashiach in Matthew 27:62-65. Further, it was Jewish guards who arrested Yeshua, not Romans. Yeshua was not turned over to the Romans until after his mock trial and conviction. Not a Roman to be seen until after that. The Greek text thought to be used for the translations of the New Testament letters was in reality a translation of earlier Greek and Latin texts rather than a Greek text. Almost no Greek punctuation existed in the Second Temple period. Simply put, with the addition of punctuation, so-called translations are, in fact, a translation of a translation and are not translations of the original text. Further, the punctuation is a major reason why translators see very little Hebrew influence in the text. There is no such thing, and I know I've already said it, but we're going to say it again. There is no such thing as a first century church. Christianity, more specifically Catholicism, did not exist until after the time of Constantine's war. The Ante-Nicene, or church fathers as they are now known, were philosophers, not religious leaders. In their time, they used religious writings, especially the New Testament letters, as a basis for this philosophical musings, a practice that had been around since the beginning of philosophical, not religious thought. Eusebius's ecclesiastical history declares, by this means, moreover, the real antiquity and divine character of Ecclesiasticus will be equally demonstrated to those who suppose that it is recent and foreign, appearing no earlier than yesterday. Any notion that Eusebius is speaking of recent events as those of time in general, which is what everybody always says, they overlook the words no earlier than yesterday. See, Greek doesn't work that way when he says this. This statement indicates that people in the early to mid 300s CE were arguing that this not yet named religion, did you realize that Catholicism, the name for that religion, did not happen in the 400s, the mid 400s? They didn't even have a name when Constantine was alive, or Eusebius, or Jerome. That all came later. They kept using the word Catholic in their writings because Catholic is the Latin word that means universal. And so they kept talking about this universal religion. And so translators assumed that they had a name 100 years before they actually decided to use that word as the name. Anyway, I hope that made some sense. You ought to take notice of, I quoted from the English translation. You ought to take notice here that the word church is not used, and that's because it didn't exist when Eusebius wrote those words. But even when he went on, Eusebius also said, but even if we are clearly new, and this really fresh name, Christianum, is recently known among the nations. Did you hear that? That's a direct quote from the English translation. But even if we are clearly new, so here's his admission that it's true, they are a new religion, and this really fresh name, Christianum, do you hear it, Christian? Is recently known among the nations. So he has just admitted that what we now call Catholicism is a new religion. Even though he started off saying it wasn't, now he's admitting that it is. And when he says, but the word Christianum was recently known, he's telling you that the word Christian was not used among the Catholics until they actually began to become Catholics. So what does that tell you? Well, it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Christians were not first called Christians at Antioch. It's not true. His words further prove that the Greek text has been tampered with, no doubt to bolster the idea that Christianity existed in the first century CE. Eusebius then attempted to create a history starting with Adam, stopping with Abraham, then jumping to the cross and ending at his time. He clearly wanted to show that this new religion aligned itself with biblical characters predating the Torah, such that there was no need to follow Jewish law, saying, if the line be traced back from Abraham to the first man, so that would be going backwards from Abraham to Adam, right? Anyone who should describe those who have obtained a good testimony for righteousness, as in fact, if not name, would not shoot wide of the truth. So here he's admitting it's a lie. It's a lie, but not a big one. Wow. Eusebius, the official church historian. All the documents from the Assumption of Moses to the writings of the Maccabees, Josephus, Philo, the Apocrypha, the Ante-Nicene Fathers, and any English translation of the New Testament letters is tainted by these altered realities. Thus, comparing various New Testament translations is an utter waste of time. Additionally, we do not definitively know where the Greek fragments came from, when they were written, nor who they were written by. We do know that they were copies of earlier documents, but we do not know how many generations removed they are from the originals. There could have been, I should say, many generations of these documents handed down during the first century alone. Somebody copies it, gives it to somebody else, they copy it. That person who just copied the second level gives it to somebody else, and they copy his, and down the. I mean, it could have been hundreds of generations removed by the time you get to the end of the first century. Still, having translated the entirety of the New Testament letters, I now believe with absolute confidence that these letters in their entirety were originally written in Hebrew. Now, this is a claim also made by Jerome himself. You can find it in Lives of Illustrious Men, Book 5. Eusebius' Ecclesiastical History in 338, 2 through 3. And to a small, unwitting degree, Epiphanes in, I don't know how to say the word, Panarion, section 30, verse 3 and 6, in his argument against a Hebrew original. You should read it. He's actually proving that it was a Hebrew original, arguing against it. It's kind of funny. All right, let's talk about these issues I have with punctuation. Isaiah 59, verse 19 says, when the enemy shall come in like a flood, comma, the Spirit of the Lord shall lift up a standard against him. That's King James Version. The placement of the comma causes the enemy to come in like a flood. However, if the comma is moved as follows, when the enemy shall come in, comma, like a flood, the Spirit of the Lord shall lift a standard up against him. The focus now shifts to God coming in like a flood instead of the enemy coming in like a flood. For the most part, translators utilized the punctuation later added to the Greek, which was mostly guesswork. This verse should not be taken to mean that God only moves when a horrible attack comes against his people. In biblical Hebrew, we know that if God strikes hard against a vicious attack, then God strikes against an attack to whatever degree is measured out, whether small or large. We know this because God is a just and righteous God. Here are some additional reasons why no one has ever actually translated the New Testament letters correctly. I didn't finish that sentence for some reason. 1, Greek and English grammar have no place in the ancient Hebrew world. We must separate ourselves from our need to understand Hebrew and English. In other words, we must divorce ourselves from the English language, from our customs, from our culture, from our history, from our grammar, and understand the Hebrew and Greek texts in the Hebrew and Greek languages if we are ever going to accurately translate the writings and the times of the New Testament letters. Secondly, Christian history has no place in these letters. I've just shown you that it didn't exist during the time of these letters. These letters are Jewish and thus connected only to Jewish customs, culture, and history. Only to the Jews. 3, many, if not all, modern so-called Jewish New Testaments are connecting rabbinic customs from the wrong time periods. For example, The idea of making the ziziot, or fringes with knots and windings that represent the 613 laws, did not exist in the first century CE. These things, you see how they're, well, you probably can't see it, but there's twistings and bindings, and once you get from here to here, you have, then it represents the number 613. That idea did not exist in the first century, not even a little bit. Further, the problem with following the conclusions of sages is the possibility, perhaps even likelihood, that a sage from the Dark Ages, while attempting to wipe away some interpretation he did not agree with, wrote that some Rav, that's what rabbis are actually called, but when they're not your rabbi, you call them Rav, and if they're your rabbi, you call them Rabbi, or rabbi in English. So I said Rav because that's the correct way to say it. Anyway, he's trying to wipe away some interpretation that he did not agree with. So he writes that some Rav, in the name of some other Rav, somewhere in the past, used to say something that, of course, has never before been heard, but now proves somehow that his interpretation, to the interpretation to which he agrees, is wrong. I hope you followed that. The first written claim of 613 laws is being in the Torah, that the Torah contains 613 laws. Appears in the Mishnah, written by a 4th century sage during the 500s, that's the 4th century, CE, whose name was Ar Simlai. That's the first mention in all of history in the 500s. So it did not exist in the 1st century. See what's happening here with these new Jewish translations? No attempt was made to specify individual commandments until the late 8th century CE. In other words, in the 900s, AD as it's called, when Simon Cairo listed 348 negative laws and 268 positive, or 65 positive. In the late 1100s CE, a man by the name of Maimonides, did I say 11? Yeah. Also known as Rambam, which is an acronym for Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, composed a book called Sefer HaMitzvot, the Scroll of the Law, which means, I just said that. In this book, sorry, sweating and now itching. In this book, Maimonides listed 365 negative laws and 248 positive and divided them into subjects. Maimonides divided the negative commands into 10 categories and the positive commands into 10 categories. He did this because the 10 commandments, as they are known to the Western world, are actually called the 10 Devarim, or the 10, that's literally words, but the 10 categories. There is a strong possibility that almost all Jewish names were changed by the Catholic Church. There's a good example of this in Acts chapter 19. Oh my goodness. I'm going to stop. I just saw the time. We'll pick up with name changes next week. Shalom, shalom, everyone.
The blessing, Be'ivrit. Yavarecha Yahweh v'yish merecha. Ya'er Yahweh panai v'lecha v'hunecha. Yisa Yahweh panai v'lecha v'yasim lecha shalom. And in English, may Yahweh cause you to lie down so that you may rest. May he touch and caress you. May he prepare you for what is ahead. May he watch over you. May he keep you from harm. May he cause goodness to grow in you and take away the bad. May he arrange your life and cause you to flourish. May he cheer you up and gladden your heart. May he cause his light to shine through you. May he show you tenderness, favor, and love in his presence. May he show you kindness and be delicate towards you. May he show you his generosity, mercy, compassion, and desire for you as it comes forth from the depths of his soul. May he lift you out of your pit and deliver you from the things that hold you prisoner. May he draw you to his chest and cast his eyes on yours. May he show you his love and desire for you as he cradles you in his arms. May he bear your punishment and pardon you of your sin. May he take you for his bride. May he establish a foundation in you. May he place his name on your heart and mind and make your body his temple. May you be his treasure. May you always be on his mind. May he draw you near and comfort you when you are afraid. May he assure you there is nothing to fear because he is with you. May you and all that concerns you be at peace because he is your friend. Amen.